I never meant to tell this story. More than 20 years have passed, yet I still wake up at night hearing that deep, muffled sound from behind the hospital door, the one no one was supposed to open. Maybe I'm saying this now because silence became heavier than fear. My name is Marissa Lawson. Back in 1998, I worked as a nurse at a small private hospital in northern Montana. It wasn't much to look at, 2 stories, beige walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, but it carried a strange reputation, even among the staff. Officially, it was a government-funded facility for rare infectious disease research. Unofficially, it was the kind of place where you learned not to ask questions. I was 28 then, fresh from a nursing program, still believing in rules, in systems, in the idea that hospitals existed to heal. That illusion began to crack the winter the military trucks started showing up. They came late at night, their engines idling in the snow, headlights dimmed. Men in unmarked uniforms would unload sealed containers, rolling them toward the West Wing, the one we called the isolation unit. It was supposed to be under renovation, but none of us ever saw construction crews. That wing was always locked. A heavy reinforced door with a magnetic seal and a small glass window that revealed nothing but darkness beyond. The older nurses said it had been closed since the early 90s after some classified accident, but now the locks were new, the security cameras freshly installed, and there was a new smell in the hallway, sterile, metallic, and cold, like the air in a morgue. I worked the night shift most days. Fewer questions were asked at night. You kept your head down, recorded vitals, administered medications, and pretended not to hear the sounds from the restricted corridor. The faint hum of machinery, the occasional echo of movement, something dragging. I told myself it was just maintenance equipment, that every old building had its noises. But this wasn't the creak of pipes or air vents. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone, or something, breathing behind the walls. One evening, near midnight, a patient in the East Ward started coding, and I ran for supplies. The supply room sat directly opposite the isolation door. While fumbling for the defibrillator pads, I heard footsteps from the restricted side, slow, heavy, uneven. My heart froze. The sound stopped exactly on the other side of the door, and then, faintly, something pressed against the glass. I saw only the blur of movement, but the shape was too tall to be human. I didn't mention it to anyone, not because I wasn't frightened, I was, but because in that place, curiosity was dangerous. Nurses who asked too much about the isolation unit didn't last long. Some got transferred without notice, others simply stopped showing up. The administration always had the same explanation: personal reasons. The days grew colder. Snow piled against the windows, and the road to town was often impassable. That winter felt endless. The kind of cold that seeped through walls, through bones, through sleep. But beneath that ordinary hardship, the hospital felt alive in a way it shouldn't. There was movement where there shouldn't be movement, lights flickering in sealed rooms, and at times, faint vibrations traveling through the floor like machinery buried deep below. I started noticing patterns too, deliveries arriving only after midnight, always escorted by 2 men in hazmat suits. They'd sign no papers, talk to no one, and disappear through that door. One night I stayed longer on purpose, pretending to reorganize medication trays. At 2:17 a.m., a siren briefly wailed from inside the isolation wing, cut short after 3 seconds. Then silence. The next morning, no one mentioned it. It was as if the sound had never happened. Rumors spread quietly. Some said the government was testing new vaccines. Others whispered about radiation burns and quarantine soldiers, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a virus or a weapon. It was something alive, something that didn't belong in any medical record. I started writing notes to myself, times, noises, smells, tiny details I could cross-reference later because memory alone felt unreliable. That's when I realized the air temperature near the isolation wing was always lower than the rest of the building, sometimes by 10 degrees. The thermometer on the wall confirmed it. The cold wasn't coming from outside, it was being generated, deliberately. Then came the night that changed everything. A blizzard had cut power across half the county, and our backup generators kicked in with a violent jolt. For several minutes, the electronic locks failed. I remember the door light flickering from red to green, unlocked. My breath fogged in the air as I stood there, frozen between fear and the kind of curiosity that ruins people. I told myself I'd just check that everything was secure, that no patient was in danger. But when I touched the handle, the metal felt warm, almost pulsing, like something was breathing through it. And then, from the other side, I heard it. A low, drawn-out exhale, deep enough to vibrate the glass. That's when I should have walked away, but I didn't. It all began in December, when the snow came down in sheets thick enough to erase the roads and the mountains disappeared into a gray blur. The temperature dropped below -30, the kind of cold that made metal sting through gloves and turned every breath into steam. The hospital's main power lines froze that month, and for weeks we ran on backup generators that hummed constantly, filling the halls with a low vibration you could feel through the soles of your shoes. That was also when we first received the new order. No one from the regular staff was to approach the western corridor under any circumstance. Officially, it was due to a containment procedure. Unofficially, it was the first time we realized how little control we actually had inside that building. Over the course of one night, the maintenance crew installed a reinforced metal door at the end of the hall. The old one had been made of wood with a simple lock, but this one looked like something taken from a military bunker, thick, gray, fitted with a magnetic seal and a keypad that flashed green when the security team entered their codes. Above it hung a sign printed in red, Biohazard Level 4, authorized personnel only. The first time I saw it, I thought it was a joke. Level 4 meant the kind of pathogens you only read about in defense reports, the ones that never leave underground labs. We weren't that kind of hospital. At least, we weren't supposed to be. For the next several weeks, strange shipments began arriving after midnight. I'd hear the sound of wheels echoing down the tiled hallways, metal trolleys carrying oxygen tanks, refrigerated units, sealed containers with no labels. They were escorted by men who didn't wear standard hospital badges. Their suits weren't the usual blue scrubs or white coats. They wore black, with masks that covered their faces completely, like something designed for chemical exposure. Every delivery went straight through that new door, and once it closed, the corridor returned to its heavy silence, interrupted only by the faint hiss of the ventilation system. I asked one of the orderlies about it, an older man named Carter, who had been working there for over 15 years. He shook his head before I even finished the question. "Don't," he said quietly. "They're monitoring the hallways now. You don't want to show up on a report." I laughed it off at first, but later that week, one of the newer nurses, Kelsey, made a joke about the monster wing during a staff meeting. By the next morning, her locker was empty and her nameplate was gone. The administration claimed she'd taken leave to care for a relative. None of us believed it. From that point on, the West Wing became a ghost. The lights there never turned off, even during the night shifts, and the hum of the generators was loudest near that end of the building. Sometimes I caught the faint smell of antiseptic drifting through the vents, sharp and unnatural, mixed with something metallic. Once, while delivering charts to the lab, I noticed frost forming on the floor tiles near the restricted door, a thin layer that melted instantly when I touched it. The air felt colder there, heavy and sterile, as if whatever was inside was lowering the temperature on purpose. At the nurses' station, the rumors multiplied. Some said the government had brought in a patient infected with a bioengineered virus. Others whispered about classified experiments, hybrid research, or a crash recovery no one wanted to talk about. I didn't believe any of it at first, but then I started noticing the patterns in the logbook: missing hours, forged signatures, equipment requests that didn't match our inventory. Something was being erased in real time. My shifts stretched longer that winter, from 7 in the evening until dawn. Those were the hours when the hospital felt like another world, sterile, humming, detached from the town buried in snow outside. The sound of the wind against the windows mixed with the low thrum of generators, and beneath it all, something else, something faint but deliberate. It wasn't the noise of machines or pipes. It was rhythmic, almost organic, like a pulse. I began to think the sign on that new metal door wasn't just a warning about infection. It was a warning about what they were keeping alive behind it. It was close to midnight when I first saw them. 2 orderlies pushing a covered gurney down the west corridor, the one that led straight to the isolation wing. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered as they passed, their reflections gliding across the floor like ghosts. The sheet draped over the stretcher wasn't the usual white cotton we used for patients. It was gray, industrial, the kind used for transport or containment. Even from a distance, I could see it wasn't just another body under there. The outline was wrong. The arms, or what looked like arms, were too long, the shoulders too broad, the torso rising higher than it should have. Whatever was beneath that tarp wasn't shaped like any human I'd ever seen. They moved quickly, trying to avoid notice, but the corridor was empty, except for me. I was carrying medical charts back to the station when they turned the corner. My first thought was that it was some kind of accident victim, maybe from one of the remote military testing sites nearby. But as they drew closer, that explanation started to collapse under its own weight. The thing under the cover shifted slightly as the stretcher bumped over a seam in the tile, and for the briefest moment the fabric stretched tight enough for me to see the outline of a hand, or something like a hand, with fingers far longer than any human's, each joint bent at an unnatural angle. Instinct told me to turn away, but my feet wouldn't move. One of the orderlies, a man I didn't recognize, noticed me watching. He stopped just long enough to meet my eyes, and the look he gave me was pure warning. "Don't look," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. "It's not one of ours." Then, without another word, they pushed the gurney toward the isolation door. The electronic lock clicked open with a sharp hiss. The light above it flashed green, and the heavy metal door slid aside. I caught a glimpse of something inside: cold light, steel walls, and the faint reflection of movement, and then the door sealed shut behind them with a mechanical thud that echoed all the way down the hall. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at that door, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Hospitals can make you numb to strange sights: burn victims, trauma cases, bodies that don't look like bodies anymore. But this was different. This wasn't the aftermath of injury. This was something that didn't belong in any hospital bed. When I finally made it back to the nurse's station, my hands were shaking so badly that I spilled half a cup of coffee across the logbook. I tried to record the time, but I couldn't remember what to write. There was no protocol for this. Later that night, when the corridors went quiet again, I went back to that spot. The floor where the gurney had rolled was marked with faint streaks of moisture, almost like condensation, but colder, darker. It left a metallic smell in the air, ozone and antiseptic, mixed with something faintly organic. The temperature in that part of the hallway had dropped several degrees. The digital thermostat on the wall blinked between readings as though it couldn't decide how cold it really was. The next morning, I checked the patient logs. Every admission, every discharge, every transfer for that night was listed as routine. No new entries. No record of anyone brought in after 11 p.m. It was as if the entire event had never happened. When I asked the charge nurse if any new patients had arrived overnight, she just gave me a puzzled look and said, "No, not a single one." I almost believed her until I walked past the isolation door again at the end of my shift and noticed a small smear on the lower edge of the frame. It wasn't blood, it was something darker, thicker, and it shimmered faintly under the fluorescent light like oil on water. That was the first time I realized the real danger in that hospital wasn't the virus, the cold, or the isolation. It was the silence, the kind that spreads from one person to another until everyone learns to stop asking questions. The next morning, I made the mistake of asking questions. During shift change, when the night team passed updates to the day staff, I caught Dr. Avery between rounds. He was the kind of man who always looked half exhausted, half bored, sleeves rolled up, stethoscope hanging loose, the permanent smell of coffee and disinfectant following him everywhere. I waited until we were alone near the medication cabinets and asked, as casually as I could, who was being treated inside the isolation wing. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable, and said in a tone that made my stomach twist, "If you want to keep your job, forget whatever you think you saw." The way he said it wasn't angry, but final, like a door closing. I tried to smile it off, to make it sound like idle curiosity, but he wasn't listening anymore. He gathered his chart and walked away without another word. That silence was louder than any warning could have been. From that moment, everything in the hospital shifted. By the time I came in for my next shift, a new security camera had been mounted above the nurses' station. It wasn't one of the cheap dome models we had before. This was high-grade, military issue, with an LED indicator that blinked red every few seconds. The sign-in desk where we recorded visitors had been replaced too, upgraded with a digital log system connected directly to the administrative server. When I flipped through the printed visitor sheets later that night, I noticed several empty lines where names should have been, timestamps with no corresponding signatures. Someone was editing the logs in real time, removing evidence of who had been entering that corridor. Even stranger were the new faces showing up on the night shifts. Men in plain clothes, always in pairs, carrying clipboards with no hospital logos. They moved with quiet precision, never greeting anyone, never taking breaks in the cafeteria. Their badges simply read, "Consultant." When you tried to read their names, the print was always smudged, as if worn down deliberately. I once overheard one of them speaking on a radio near the loading dock. Short bursts of coded language, references to containment levels and stabilization cycles. It didn't sound like anything from a medical manual. A week later, we were given new ID cards. Ours opened every part of the hospital except the isolation wing. That one now required dual verification, 2 separate key cards inserted simultaneously, along with a retinal scan. The air vents leading into that corridor were sealed, and a separate filtration system was installed behind the walls. Whatever was inside wasn't meant to be treated. It was meant to be contained. The tension spread quietly through the staff. Conversations stopped when supervisors walked by. People started whispering in the supply rooms instead of the hallways. The usual warmth of a hospital, even one as small as ours, faded into something colder, more mechanical. Every action, every sound, every breath felt monitored. One night, while I was recording vitals, the new security monitor above the desk flickered for a moment. For less than a second, it displayed an image that shouldn't have been there. Not the nurse's station, not any part of the building I recognized. It showed a dim room lined with frost-covered walls, and in the center, a shape on a table, too large for a human frame. I blinked, and the image was gone, replaced by the normal feed of the hallway. I told myself it was a glitch. I wanted to believe that. But when I looked up at the camera above me, its red light was no longer blinking. It was a steady, unbroken glow, like an unblinking eye. That was the night I stopped writing notes in the logbook. I started keeping my records somewhere no one could find them, in my head. Sometimes at night, when the building emptied into that eerie quiet only hospitals know, I'd be the last one awake at the nurse's station. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, the wall clock ticked with mechanical precision, and beyond that, nothing. No footsteps, no intercoms, no sound except the faint vibration that lived inside the walls. The isolation wing was just down the hall, separated by that thick metal door, but even from here I could hear it breathing. It wasn't constant, more like waves, a deep, resonant sound that pulsed through the concrete. At first, I thought it was just the ventilation system or maybe the generators downstairs, but after a while, I realized the rhythm was too natural, too steady. It was the slow inhale and exhale of something alive. That winter, the storms outside never stopped. Snow beat against the windows like sand, and sometimes the power lines crackled with frozen static. During those nights, the whole hospital felt cut off from the world, an island of flickering light in the middle of endless white. And in that silence, the smallest sound from behind the isolation door became enormous. There were nights when the hum inside the wall deepened until it became almost a growl, and the floor seemed to vibrate softly beneath my feet. I'd lower the volume on the patient monitors just to make sure it wasn't my imagination, but it never helped. The sound was real. It came from somewhere beneath us, steady as a heartbeat, slow and impossibly deep. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that the mind plays tricks on you in long hours and low light. But sometimes, when the air vents kicked in, I caught a smell that didn't belong. Cold metal, antiseptic, and something faintly organic like wet soil after rain. The air itself seemed heavier, thicker, as if whatever they were keeping in that wing had changed the atmosphere. Then, one night, it happened. Around 3 in the morning, during another snowstorm, the lights flickered twice and went out completely. The monitors on my desk dimmed, and the hospital sank into total darkness. For the first few seconds, the only sound was the wind screaming outside. Then, somewhere behind the walls, the generators began to stutter and hum, trying to start. I remember standing up, my flashlight shaking in my hand, when I noticed movement in the reflection of the glass partition across the hall. At first it was just a blur, a darker shape within the darkness, sliding past the frosted window that looked into the isolation corridor. My breath caught in my throat. The emergency lights hadn't yet come on, so the entire hallway was lit only by the faint blue of the moon filtering through the storm. In that pale glow, something massive passed by, tall enough that its shadow filled the window from top to bottom. It moved slowly, heavily, the way a person might if gravity didn't quite apply to them the same way. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw it pause. A faint outline of a head turning, the reflection of amber eyes catching what little light there was. Then the backup power surged to life, flooding the hall with a harsh white glare. The window was empty. The corridor beyond was still. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind had stitched shapes out of darkness, the way it always does when fear takes over. But as I walked toward the nurse's station, the floor beneath me trembled once, a low, resonant thud that came from deep below the isolation wing, as if something enormous had shifted in its sleep. When morning came, no one mentioned the blackout. The security team reviewed the power logs, said it was just a temporary overload, nothing unusual. But I knew what I'd seen, or rather, what I hadn't. The shadow that moved in silence through a sealed corridor, the one no human was supposed to enter. After that night, I stopped doubting the stories. Something was alive behind that door, and it was no longer sleeping. After the blackout, the hospital never felt the same. The power flickered more often, the generators groaned under constant strain, and the red restricted access lights above the isolation corridor began to pulse irregularly, as if the system itself was losing control. 2 nights later, during another shift alone, the magnetic lock on the isolation door started flashing. green, then red, then green again. An error code I'd never seen before. I should have called maintenance, reported a system malfunction, done what any reasonable nurse would do. But curiosity has a way of disguising itself as duty. I told myself I needed to check the temperature controls or the oxygen feed, just to make sure nothing was malfunctioning inside. The corridor was silent, so still it felt airless. My gloved hand hovered over the access panel. When I pressed gently against the door, it moved. The seal broke with a faint hiss, releasing a wave of cold air that smelled faintly of metal and disinfectant. For a moment I just stood there, half expecting alarms to start blaring. But none came. Only the steady hum of machines deeper inside. The air itself felt wrong, too dense and unnaturally cold, like the temperature had dropped several degrees just beyond the threshold. I took a step forward. Inside, the lighting was minimal, thin fluorescent strips along the ceiling, half of them flickering, the rest dead. The walls weren't painted or tiled like the rest of the hospital. They were brushed steel, industrial and seamless, reflecting what little light there was in long, distorted lines. It didn't look like a medical ward at all. It looked like a containment lab. I followed the corridor slowly, my shoes squeaking faintly against the metal floor. That's when I saw them, marks on the ground. At first, I thought they were tire tracks from the equipment trolleys that came in during those late-night deliveries. But the further I looked, the clearer it became that they weren't alone. Beside them, pressed deep into the thin layer of dust that had settled over the floor, were footprints, bare ones. Except they were far too large, at least half a meter long, with visible arches, distinct toes, and a stride so wide that I had to stretch my legs to match even half the distance between them. I crouched down and ran my flashlight along the nearest print. The edges were sharp, freshly made, as if whatever left them had walked this hallway only hours ago. The weight behind each step had slightly warped the metal beneath. My pulse quickened. I told myself they might belong to some kind of test suit, maybe oversized protective boots, but the logic didn't hold. There were no tread patterns, no seams. They were organic. And the shape of the toes, wide, curved slightly inward, didn't match any human anatomy I knew. As I moved further inside, I noticed faint condensation clinging to the lower walls, frost crystals forming along the seams of the floor. The deeper I went, the colder it became, until my breath turned visible in front of me. I could hear a soft dripping sound somewhere ahead, slow and rhythmic, echoing off the metal surfaces. Then another sound, one that didn't belong to any machine, a low resonant exhale, distant but heavy enough to vibrate in my chest. The corridor ended at a set of double doors with small observation windows. The glass was frosted from the inside, and behind it, faint light pulsed in slow intervals, like a heartbeat. I took one hesitant step closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and saw something move on the other side of the glass. A shape, enormous, upright, and shifting slightly as though breathing. That's when a faint alarm beeped behind me, the magnetic lock re-engaging. The door I had entered through was sealing itself again. For one brief second I thought about turning back, slipping out before it closed, but instead I stood frozen, caught between fascination and terror. The isolation wing was no longer a mystery I could ignore. It was alive, and I was standing inside it. At the very end of the corridor stood a single door, reinforced steel, the kind used in cryogenic chambers. A faded number was stenciled above the frame, 12. The rest of the hall was empty, lined with blank panels and sealed vents, but everything seemed to converge towards that room. A thin band of light glowed from beneath the door, flickering faintly as if powered by its own circuit. My breath fogged the glass as I leaned closer to the observation window. Inside, the air looked hazy, almost frosted, the temperature clearly much lower than the rest of the corridor. For a moment, all I saw was the pale reflection of my own face in the glass. Then, as my eyes adjusted, The outline on the bed came into focus. It wasn't just a patient. It was something far larger. Broad shoulders that stretched almost to the rails of the bed. Limbs too long, chest rising and falling with slow, heavy rhythm. The body was covered head to toe in a thick layer of dark hair, coarse and uneven, like that of an animal that had lived its whole life in the cold. The head was partially turned toward the window, but a translucent oxygen mask covered most of the face. Beneath it, I could make out a wide, flattened nose, a heavy brow ridge, and skin that looked rougher than any human's, almost textured. I remember searching for signs of injury, bandages, IV lines, anything that would suggest this was a person under care, but what I saw instead felt deliberate. Monitors surrounded the bed on every side, displaying stable readings, pulse, oxygen saturation, temperature. Everything was steady, almost unnaturally so. Then I noticed the anomaly, the heart rate. 40 beats per minute, half the normal human rhythm. The ECG line moved slow and steady, a calm, controlled pulse that didn't match the size of the body it measured. Whatever it wasn't fighting for its life. It was resting, stable, sedated. Beside the bed stood several IV poles, each holding white fluid bags labeled only Protein C12 in black marker. The handwriting was sharp, military style. There was no manufacturer name, no dosage, no lot number. Each line from those bags led into the creature's arm, and even through the glass I could see the veins, thick and dark, running like cables beneath the skin. A cooling unit hummed softly near the base of the bed, its vents releasing thin clouds of vapor that pooled on the floor and drifted upward, catching the light in silver ribbons. For a few seconds, I forgot to breathe. I'd seen trauma victims, burn patients, even rare deformities that made the familiar look alien. But this was different. This wasn't a mutation. It was another order of being, the proportions, the muscle structure, the mass. It was as though someone had taken the human form and pushed it past nature's limits. It was both majestic and wrong, something that demanded reverence and fear at the same time. The monitor near the headboard emitted a faint tone, drawing my eyes to a small digital display, core temperature 86 degrees Celsius. Too low for a human. I glanced at the cooling system again and realized it wasn't regulating the room's air, it was maintaining the patient's body temperature. The chill I'd felt since entering wasn't accidental. The entire environment was designed to preserve whatever this was in a state between life and suspension. A shadow passed across the glass, not from inside, but from the ceiling above, where a ventilation pipe curved into the room. For a split second, I thought I saw movement, like condensation shifting inside the metal tube. The temperature gauge flickered. One of the monitors emitted a brief static pulse, then steadied. And just as I began to lean closer, the creature's chest expanded with a deep, deliberate breath. The sound carried even through the glass, low, heavy, like air being drawn through a cavern. Its eyelids twitched, and a faint vibration rolled through the walls, setting off a soft hum in the metal panels. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, but the monitors stayed calm, steady, indifferent. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't unconscious, it was aware. I took one last look at the white fluid dripping into its veins and the slow, methodical rise of its chest, then backed away from the window. For the first time since I'd started working in that hospital, I realized the truth no one dared to say out loud. The isolation wing wasn't a quarantine zone, it was a cage. I stood frozen in front of that window, the fog from my breath blurring the glass. The machines around the bed emitted their steady electronic whispers, the only sounds breaking the silence. Then one of them broke rhythm. A single sharp beep cut through the air, the blood pressure monitor. Its numbers jumped, climbing steadily higher. I looked back at the bed just in time to see the creature's chest expand, slower this time, but deeper, deliberate, as if awakening from a long, heavy sleep. The heart rate on the monitor ticked upward. 43, 46, 48. The sound of each pulse echoed in the empty corridor like distant thunder. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, to close the door and pretend none of this existed, but my body refused to obey. Then, without warning, the eyes opened. I will never forget that sight. They were a shade of amber that no light could have created, not glowing, not reflective, but alive, as if lit from within. The pupils were large and deep, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. For a long moment they didn't move, simply fixed on a point in the distance. And then they found me. The air between us seemed to freeze. I don't know how I knew, but it wasn't just looking, it was seeing, understanding. Those eyes didn't carry confusion or panic the way human patients do when they wake from sedation. There was focus, awareness, and something else, something almost human in its stillness. Every instinct I had as a nurse, every protocol drilled into me, vanished. I could feel the thrum of my heartbeat in my fingertips, the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. The creature didn't move. It simply watched, its breathing slow, measured, and impossibly calm. The oxygen mask shifted slightly as it exhaled, releasing a small cloud of condensation into the cold air. I took a step back, and its gaze followed, perfectly synchronized with my movement. Not curious, not aggressive, observant, like a person trying to recall a memory. My hand brushed against the glass, and the temperature difference was so intense it burned. The condensation on the window froze instantly under my touch. That was the moment it blinked, a slow, deliberate motion that somehow felt like acknowledgement. Behind it, one of the monitors emitted another tone, softer this time, like a heartbeat syncing with mine. The ECG steadied again at 48 beats per minute. The creature's eyes shifted slightly toward the sound, then back to me. It was as though it recognized what the machines were doing, measuring it, monitoring it, and was letting it happen. For a second I felt something impossible, calm. Not safety, not comfort, but a strange, quiet understanding that whatever was lying in that bed wasn't simply reacting to me, it was studying me, the same way I had been studying it. I don't know how long we stood like that, seconds, maybe less. But the world outside the glass seemed to fall away. Then the overhead light flickered, breaking the spell. The creature's eyelids lowered slowly, almost like it was choosing to end the moment. Its heart rate settled back to 45. The breathing became rhythmic again. I stumbled backward, unable to take my eyes off that window. Even as I reached the door, the reflection of those amber eyes stayed fixed in my vision, as if they'd burned themselves into the glass or into me. For the first time, I realized I hadn't discovered the thing in that room. It had allowed me to see it. The following morning, I was summoned to the administrator's office. The request came through the intercom in that clipped, bureaucratic tone that made your stomach sink before you even understood why. The moment I walked in, I knew it wasn't routine. The blinds were drawn, the air was cold, and Dr. Avery sat across from the hospital director, both of them too composed, too rehearsed. Miss Lawson, the director began without preamble, there was an unscheduled inspection of the isolation unit last night. Access to that section is now permanently restricted. No one, under any circumstances, is authorized to enter without clearance. Your presence in that corridor was noted. Consider this a verbal warning. He spoke as though reading from a prepared script, each word devoid of emotion. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I had heard a malfunction, that I was checking on safety equipment, but something in Dr. Avery's expression stopped me cold. His eyes didn't accuse, they warned. Whatever this inspection had been, it wasn't about security, it was about control. I nodded, muttered an apology, and left without another word. That afternoon, the new locks were installed, Double magnetic seals, retinal scanners, even motion detectors positioned in the hallway. Within hours, the entire wing was sealed off like a tomb. No one spoke about it. The nurses avoided the subject, the orderlies kept their heads down, and even the cleaning staff refused to go near the west corridor. It was as if that part of the hospital had been erased overnight, both from the building and from our collective memory. A week later, 2 orderlies from the night shift were gone. Officially, they'd been dismissed for breach of conduct. Unofficially, no one had seen them leave. One of them was Peter Hall, a quiet man in his 40s who often worked alone, the same one I'd seen pushing that covered gurney. When he didn't show up for his next shift, I thought he'd simply quit like so many others. But 2 days later, his car was found near the riverbank, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. There were no footprints leading away, just tire marks in the mud that ended abruptly at the water's edge. The police ruled it an accident. The rest of us knew better. By February, the hospital began to fall apart. Literally. Entire sections of the West Wing were cordoned off with plastic sheets, scaffolding, and warning signs claiming structural hazard, mold contamination. It sounded plausible enough, except for one detail. The demolition crews worked only at night. Heavy trucks came and went between midnight and dawn, their cargo tarped and sealed, escorted by the same black-suited men I'd seen months earlier. One night, I parked farther from the entrance and stayed late under the pretense of finishing reports. From the break room window, I watched the convoy move in silence, unmarked transport vehicles rolling toward the restricted wing. The workers loaded large metallic containers, each one hermetically sealed and stamped with the International Biohazard symbol. Frost covered their surfaces even in the heated air, as though whatever was inside radiated cold. When the last truck pulled away, the head contractor sprayed something along the loading ramp, a gray chemical mist that hung in the air like smoke. The next morning, there was no trace of it, just the lingering scent of ozone and bleach. 2 weeks later, the wing was gone. They didn't just renovate it, they erased it. Concrete trucks arrived and poured over the foundation where the isolation corridor had been. The space that once echoed with the hum of machines and the faint rhythm of slow, unnatural breathing was buried under a seamless slab of cement. By spring, a new maintenance wing was built over it, sterile, quiet, anonymous. Officially, the hospital had passed every inspection. The files labeled Isolation Unit were deleted from the system, the ID cards reissued, and every mention of those months vanished from the archives. But late at night, when the building settled and the generators rumbled beneath the floor, I could still feel a faint vibration coming through the walls. Not loud, not constant, just enough to remind me that concrete doesn't erase what's still alive underneath it. 2 days after the demolition, I received a letter in my mailbox. Plain white envelope, no hospital seal, no signature. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one line. Your position has been terminated due to staff reduction. That was it. No explanation, no severance, no formal meeting. After 5 years of service, they erased me with a single sentence. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I called the hospital administration, but the line disconnected after the first ring. I tried again, and the automated message said the number was no longer in service. I drove there the next morning, but the security guards at the gate told me the facility was closed for restructuring. Through the fence, I could see that my old parking spot had already been paved over. The entire west wing, the one they'd built over the sealed foundation, looked brand new. No trace of the isolation unit, no memory that it had ever existed. I tried reaching out to Dr. Avery. The phone number on my contacts list gave me the same response. This number is not in service. His email bounced back, and when I looked him up in the medical registry, there was nothing. No active license, no forwarding address, no digital footprint. It was as if he'd been deleted, not just from the hospital, but from every official record. I asked around. other nurses, former colleagues, and they all gave me the same puzzled look. No one remembered him. The few staff members who had worked in the West Wing were gone too. Their names were missing from the payroll archives. Even the internal memos we used to receive daily had been purged from the system. The hospital's database listed an East section and a main laboratory, but there was no mention of a West Wing at all. I still had my old ID card. It was the only proof I had that the place had once existed. The chip inside no longer scanned on any system. After that, I stopped trying to find answers. Every path led to static, to silence, to blank screens. And yet, the questions never stopped following me. I moved to a small town 200 miles away, took a nursing job in a private clinic, tried to rebuild a normal life. But the past doesn't vanish. It lingers quietly, waiting for you in the spaces between sleep and waking. Sometimes when I can't rest, I see that hospital in my dreams, the dim corridors, the cold metal walls, the hum of machines buried underground. And always at the end of the hallway, behind the frosted glass of room 12, those amber eyes open again. Not angry, not cruel, just watchful, as if they remember me the same way I remember them. I tell myself it's only memory, that trauma reshapes itself into nightmares. But every time I drive near the outskirts of the old town, something happens that I can't explain. When I pass the field where the hospital once stood, my car radio fills with static, and the steering wheel vibrates faintly in my hands. Sometimes the ground itself seems to tremble, not a quake, not machinery, but something deep, slow, rhythmic, breathing. People say the new building there is perfectly normal, a logistics center now, bright and sterile, humming with fluorescent light. But when the wind shifts just right, carrying that metallic scent I could never forget, I feel the same chill run down my spine as I did that night behind the observation glass. Because somewhere beneath that concrete slab, under the layers of new paint and polished floors, I know something still stirs. And when the world above goes silent, I swear it listens back. Years passed before I ever spoke about it again. The memory had become something half-buried, like a dream I tried to convince myself had never happened. But time doesn't erase certain things. It only teaches you how to hide them. Then one day, an investigative journalist came to the clinic where I worked. He was doing a piece on decommissioned research facilities, government contracts, closed hospitals, missing personnel. The moment he mentioned Montana, something inside me tightened. I told him I might have information, but he'd need to promise not to use my name. We met that evening in a small diner off the highway. I told him everything, from the first shipments that arrived at the hospital to the night I saw the eyes open behind the glass. He listened politely at first, scribbling notes between sips of coffee, but the more I spoke, the more skeptical his expression became. When I finished, he leaned back and said it sounded like a dozen other stories he'd heard before. Rumors about genetic experiments, government cover-ups, the usual conspiracy lore. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out the only thing I had kept all these years, a medical file, yellowed with age, the edges brittle. It had no hospital logo, no patient name, only a black ink heading at the top. Specimen A13, recovery ongoing. The paper still smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold metal. When I handed it to him, his fingers trembled slightly. He opened it, read the line, and went pale. For a long moment he didn't speak. Finally he looked up and asked where I'd gotten it. I told him it had been slipped into my locker the night before I was dismissed, inside an envelope with no note. He wanted to take it for verification, but I refused. It was the only proof I had that any of it was real. He nodded slowly, his skepticism fading into something closer to fear. Before he left, he asked if I'd ever been contacted by anyone from the old hospital. I said no, though even as the word left my mouth, I wasn't sure it was true. For years there was nothing, no calls, no letters, no sign that anyone remembered. And then, 3 weeks ago, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a single photograph printed on matte paper. It showed a lab. Dim, aged, but unmistakably the same sterile layout I remembered. The window behind the bed looked out onto a pine forest dusted with snow. The equipment was older now, cables yellowed with time, but on the bed lay the same enormous figure, the same silhouette I'd seen through the glass decades earlier. At the bottom of the photo, written in uneven black ink, were 4 words: "He is alive. Facility relocated north." I must have stared at it for hours. Every detail matched: the cold light, the steel walls, the oxygen mask. Only now, there were 2 monitors beside the bed, and one of them displayed a steady pulse line. The handwriting wasn't familiar, but the paper felt deliberately old, as if someone wanted it to look like it had traveled far to reach me. Since that day, the nights have changed. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees outside my house, I hear a low hum rolling beneath it, too deep, too regular to be wind. The same tone that once resonated through the hospital walls. It comes and goes like breathing. I don't know who sent the photograph. Maybe someone who worked there, maybe someone who wants me to remember. But I do know this: they never destroyed what they found. They didn't bury it under concrete or erase it from the records. They simply moved it farther from the world, somewhere colder, quieter, where no one will stumble upon it again. And sometimes, when I wake in the dark and hear that faint vibration trembling through the floorboards, I understand what that means. It isn't gone, it's waiting, and it still remembers me.